The sky above Nanyang was burning, not with the glow of sunset, but with the quiet orange of a dying empire. The fields that once shimmered like silk under the sun now lay torn open, their furrows dark with ash. Across the central plains, the mighty Han Dynasty, 4 centuries of order, ritual, and empire, was collapsing in on itself. The Yellow River had burst its banks again. Floods had swallowed entire provinces, and a man named Wang Mang now sat upon the dragon throne, claiming to restore virtue by destroying the world that birthed him. But in the ashes of dynasties, some lives begin rather than end. Among the ruins of Nanyang, a young man named Liu Xiu carried a hoe across his shoulder and studied the land with the eyes of someone who had learned patience from the earth itself. He was tall, lean, and unassuming. A descendant of emperors, yes, but one who worked as a farmer because his family's imperial blood had long lost its privilege. His father had died early, his brother spoke of rebellion, but Liu Xiu believed in simpler things, in the rhythm of planting and harvest, in the quiet dignity of labor. To him, the empire's fall was not a political disaster, it was a human one. People were starving, not because heaven had turned away, but because men had grown deaf to suffering. In the same land, behind carved gates and whitewashed walls, lived Yin Lihua, the daughter of a respected noble family. She was known in Nanyang for her beauty, the kind that poets later compared to the moon behind clouds. But her allure was not in the softness of her face. It was in her composure. While others in her family whispered of alliances and marriages to shield their fortune from the storm, she spent her days reading, listening, and observing. Even as a girl, she saw what most failed to see, that the grandeur of the Han had turned hollow, and that the men who wore silk and titles no longer understood what it meant to serve the people beneath them. It was said that the first time Liu Xiu saw Yin Lihua, she was standing on the balcony of her family's manor. Her eyes turned toward the horizon where the city smoke met the river mist. He did not speak to her. He only saw her from a distance. Yet in that single moment, a peasant's descendant looking at a noble's daughter, something inside him shifted. It was not desire nor ambition. It was a quiet recognition, a thought that would live in him for decades. If the world ever became gentle again, it would be because of someone like her. Later that evening, when his friends teased him about his wandering gaze, he simply smiled and said the words that would echo through history. "If I ever marry, I will marry Yin Lihua." They laughed, of course. What farmer marries a noblewoman? What forgotten heir of a broken dynasty could dream of such a thing? But Liu Xiu wasn't speaking of rank or romance. He was speaking of harmony, the kind of balance he sought in everything. In a time of swords and fire, he dreamed of peace. Years passed and peace became a myth. In the capital, Wang Mang's reforms tore through the heart of society. He redrew land boundaries, abolished noble ranks, and declared new laws in the name of righteous equality. But the noble families saw robbery, the peasants saw chaos, and the soldiers saw an opportunity. The empire fractured into hundreds of rebellions, some hungry for justice, others for vengeance. Liu Xiu's older brother, Liu Yan, could not bear it. "We are the blood of Han," he said. "If we do not rise to restore it, who will?" He gathered men, weapons, and hope, 3 things the land had forgotten how to hold, and called upon his younger brother to join him. Liu Xiu hesitated. He had always believed that wars built only new graves, not new orders. Yet, as he watched the floodwaters rise and the granaries burn, he knew the soil alone could not save the people anymore. The world needed someone who could bring balance back to heaven's design, not through force, but through steadiness. So he went quietly, leaving the fields behind, carrying only his discipline and his word. Yin Lihua, too, faced the crumbling of certainty. Her family's estate was stripped by Wang Mang's soldiers, their wealth scattered, their servants conscripted into war. The refined world she had known, with music, poetry, and ceremony, vanished overnight. But she did not weep. Instead, she organized, negotiated, persuaded. She fed the refugees who gathered outside their gates. She sent her brothers to distant counties with messages of alliance, quietly building networks of loyalty even as the great lords bickered over titles. And somewhere beyond the hills, word began to spread of a young commander, Liu Xiu, a man who fought without cruelty and governed without arrogance. When his soldiers plundered a village, he punished them. When a rival surrendered, he offered them land and rest instead of the sword. His army grew, not through fear, but through faith. He was no demagogue, no shouting general, just a man whose calm became a kind of armor. The people began calling him the gentle rebel. It was this gentleness, this refusal to be consumed by rage, that made him dangerous to tyrants. For in a world where every man sought power, he sought purpose. When Yin Lihua first heard his name spoken again, she was seated beside her widowed mother, reading aloud from the book of documents, her voice steady and low. The servant entered with a traveler's report. A Liu of Nanyang, descendant of emperors, was leading an army in the north. Her hand stopped mid-sentence. For a brief moment, her eyes softened, not with surprise, but with a strange serenity, as though a long thread, invisible but unbroken, had been pulled tight again after years of silence. The empire was collapsing, faster than anyone could rebuild it. Wang Mang's capital fell to rebels. His reforms disintegrated. In the chaos, one faction rose above all. The Lulin, a movement of desperate peasants and fallen scholars who fought under banners the color of forest leaves. Liu Yan joined them. Liu Xiu, cautious and measured, earned their respect not by words, but by the simple fact that his men never went hungry and never deserted. They marched from town to town, restoring the old Han seals, invoking the ancient rites, and declaring that heaven had turned its mandate away from the false Xian and back to the true Han. But revolutions devour themselves faster than they devour their enemies. The Lulin split into factions, each with its own vision of legitimacy. It was around this time, amid campfires and exhaustion, that Liu Xiu once again saw Yin Lihua, not as a dream, but as a woman walking into the wreckage of history. Her family, displaced by war, had come north seeking safety. Among Han loyalists, when Liu Xiu received them in his provisional court, those who stood nearby later said that he looked, for the first time, uncertain. No historian can say exactly what passed between them in that moment. The records speak only of logistics, of family introductions, of letters exchanged. Yet something must have moved within both of them, for soon afterward, the calm commander who never asked anything of fate asked for her hand. Their union was delayed by war, of course. Armies do not pause for love. But to the weary soldiers around him, the idea that their leader still held faith in beauty and home became a kind of quiet inspiration. It reminded them of what they were fighting for, not crowns, not gold, but the right to live, without fear. By the year 23 CE, the rebellion had consumed half of China. Wang Mang's head fell in the capital, and for a brief moment the skies seemed clear again. Yet peace did not follow. Dozens of men now claimed the restored throne of Han. Among them was Liu Xian, a cousin of Liu Xiu who proclaimed himself Emperor Guangwu. He was charismatic, impetuous, and suspicious, the very opposite of Liu Xiu's patient strength. And so, even as the empire cheered its rebirth, another struggle began. One of brothers, cousins, and bloodlines, all claiming to be heaven's chosen. For Liu Xiu, this was not ambition. It was inevitability. He had seen too much death to crave power. But he also knew that if the Han were to live again, it needed a ruler who understood that peace was not won by swords, but by mercy. When he finally knelt before heaven to pray, his army camped beneath the bare winter trees of northern China. He did not ask for victory. He asked for balance. He asked for the strength to stay gentle in a brutal age. Far away, in a ruined courtyard in Nanyang, Yin Lihua lit a single oil lamp against the cold and whispered a prayer of her own. Two lights, two vows, flickered against the wind of history. One born from duty, one from devotion, both destined to meet again. And as the lamp burned low, the dawn broke over the central plains, revealing a world without emperors, without order, withoat mercy, waiting for two souls who, together, would teach it how to be human again. The year was 23 CE, and the land still smelled of smoke. The usurper Wang Mang was dead, torn apart by the mob he once claimed to govern. But the empire he had desecrated did not rise again. It remained in pieces, 1,000 fragments of loyalty, hunger, and fear scattered across the central plains. The Han Dynasty had been restored in name, but in truth the mandate of heaven lay, ownerless, drifting like dust above a nation that no longer knew whom to follow. In the city of Chang'an, the new ruler, Liu Xiu, called himself Emperor Guangwu, and the air filled once more with proclamations of virtue, but banners and titles could not mend rivers or feed peasants. His court swelled with opportunists, men who wore righteousness on their tongues and betrayal in their hearts. Meanwhile, far from the capital's noise, Liu Xiu remained where the wind touched the soil. He was not a man of declarations. He rebuilt supply routes, restored bridges, negotiated with local chieftains, and sent grain to starving villages. His soldiers called him the general who sleeps in the straw, because he refused silk tents and ate what they ate. He ruled not from above but from within, and that, more than any imperial edict, drew men to his cause. He was the younger brother of Liu Yan, once the flame of the Lulan rebels, the man whose passion had rallied thousands. But fire consumes itself quickly. Liu Yan had died in an ambush, betrayed by his own allies, and it was Liu Xiu, the calm shadow behind that flame, who carried his name forward. Where others shouted of destiny, Liu Xiu spoke of duty. His army moved like a quiet tide, never lingering, never looting. In every province they entered, farmers emerged from hiding to plant again, believing perhaps that heaven had not abandoned them after all. Yet for all his modesty, his rise could not go unnoticed. Emperor Guangwu's court began to whisper that the man in Nanyang was too popular, too beloved, too competent. The emperor sent him orders, first to join the court, then to surrender command. To most men, such summons from a suspicious ruler would mean execution. But Liu Xiu obeyed without complaint. He left his command in loyal hands and journeyed to Chang'an with only a handful of guards. It was an act of faith, or perhaps an act of defiance disguised as humility. The journey west was long and silent. The roads were lined with corpses, their bones picked clean by dogs and wind. Every ruin he passed whispered the same question: what was an emperor, if not a man who could feed the living? When he reached Chang'an, the capital was a mirage of order. The old palaces still stood, their eaves glittering with gold, but within them, rot festered. Ministers quarreled over rank, generals argued over spoils, and the emperor, young, proud, and insecure, mistook fear for loyalty. Liu Xiu knelt before him, head bowed low. "The people are starving," he said simply. "If we wish to restore the Han, we must restore the fields before the throne." The court murmured. Such words were dangerous. But Emperor Guangwu, half amused and half wary, waved his hand. "You are honest," he said. "Honest men are rare. You will go to the north and bring the provinces to heel in the name of Han." It was both command and exile. Guangwu's intent was clear. Send the loyal man far away, and the problem solves itself. Liu Xiu bowed again, untroubled. "As your majesty commands." And thus he left the capital, not in disgrace, but in clarity. The more he saw of crowns, the more he understood their weight. Empires were not lost through rebellion. They were lost through vanity. Back in Nanyang, Yin Lihua lived in the in-between, between safety and exile, between the life she once knew and the one history would demand of her. Her family's estate, stripped of wealth but rich in memory, became a sanctuary for refugees. She opened her granaries to the displaced, sent medicine to the sick, and quietly mediated disputes among the desperate. In a time when nobility had turned predatory, she became the rare voice of mercy. Rumors reached her of Liu Xiu's mission to the north, of how he led his troops not by command but by example, refusing excess, forbidding plunder, and paying for supplies even in enemy lands. Villagers began to say, "If the heavens have not forsaken us, it is because the gentle general walks among us." For Yin Lihua, the words were both pride and pain. Pride that the man she had once admired had become something greater. Pain that greatness always demanded distance. War devoured years. The empire's heartlands became a chessboard of shifting loyalties. Local warlords declared themselves kings, governors turned into bandits, and every village swore allegiance to a different dream. Amid this chaos, Liu Xiu's forces became a rare symbol of order. He negotiated with rival factions, absorbing their soldiers and letting their leaders live. To his men, this mercy seemed madness. Why let the enemy breathe? But Liu Xiu saw farther. A land cannot be ruled by corpses, he said. The dead build nothing. When famine struck, he ordered his troops to cultivate fields, not burn them. When merchants fled the cities, he reopened trade routes, promising fair tolls and safe passage. Slowly, painfully, the lands under his control began to breathe again. Each night, as he sat before maps and reports, the same image returned to his mind. The calm figure on the balcony. Years ago, her gaze steady against the dying light. He had seen empires collapse, kingdoms betray, armies vanish. Yet that image remained untarnished. It was not nostalgia. It was conviction that somewhere there still existed a grace worth rebuilding the world for. In the south, Yin Lihua received letters, some official, some personal. They spoke little of love, much of stability. He asked for information about refugees, grain, and family matters. But between the lines, there was warmth, a rhythm she could feel in the measured brushstrokes of his hand. He never wrote, "I miss you." He wrote, "The northern winds are cold. I hope Nanyang's fields have bloomed early this year." In that simplicity lay everything. As Liu Xiu's reputation grew, so did the danger around him. Emperor Guangwu's advisors warned that the general of the north was building a private kingdom. Fear breeds foolishness. Orders were sent to recall him, not to honor him, but to end him. Yet fate, as always, intervened through chaos. The northern provinces rose in rebellion, and Guangwu needed him more alive than dead. Thus began the campaigns that would forge the Eastern Han. Liu Xiu rode through the frostbitten plains of Hebei, where rival warlords ruled like petty gods. His army was small but disciplined, and his strategy was unlike anything the fractured empire had seen. He offered surrender before battle, refuge after defeat, and amnesty after rebellion. To those who betrayed him, he sent no executioners, only letters inviting them to return. Slowly, enemies became allies. The warlords who fought for power found themselves outmatched by a man who fought for peace. And behind him, always unseen but ever present, lingered the spirit of Yin Lihua. Her restraint, her empathy, her quiet wisdom. When his officers debated whether to seize a city by force, he thought of her calm eyes and said, "If we take the people's homes, what will we rule over? Stones?" The years between 23 and 26 CE were years of mud and blood. Not glorious conquest, but endless repair. Liu Xiu's soldiers rebuilt bridges as they advanced, planted seeds after they fought, buried the dead with ritual. By the time his banners reached the great city of Luoyang, his army no longer marched like a mob. It moved like a living organism, bound by discipline and belief. Yet victory brought a new loneliness. In camp at night, Liu Xiu would look over the hills and see the fires of hundreds of villages, each a fragment of the empire he was trying to heal. He wondered if Yin Lihua was watching the same sky. He had learned that saving a nation was a colder task than winning one. The higher he rose, the farther away humanity seemed. In Nanyang, Yin Lihua too was changing. No longer merely the daughter of a noble house, she became a leader in her own right. When bandits threatened nearby towns, she negotiated their surrender. When refugees flooded the roads, she organized shelter and rations. Her calm decisiveness earned her the respect of men who once saw women only as ornaments. They began calling her the Lady of balance, a name that would echo through later chronicles as a mirror to Liu Xiu's gentle general. Their lives moved in parallel, two orbits circling the same invisible star. By 26 CE, Liu Xiu's forces had subdued most of northern China. The people began calling him not merely general, but the restorer. His men carried banners embroidered with a single phrase, "Han shall rise again." But he knew too well what that promise meant. That for the Han to rise, the man at its center would have to fall into solitude. When the dust settled and Emperor Guangwu's regime collapsed under its own corruption, the remaining generals turned to Liu Xiu. "You are the only one fit to wear the crown," they said. "The people already see you as their ruler." He refused at first. "I did not fight to sit upon a throne," he said. But the empire no longer offered choices. Chaos demands shape, and history had chosen him to be its mold. On a spring morning, in 25 CE, under the pale light of Luoyang, Liu Xiu accepted heaven's mandate. The banners of Han rose once more, and a new era began, the Eastern Han Dynasty. In the distant hills of Nanyang, when the news reached Yin Lihua, she stood beneath the willow trees of her courtyard, the same place where years ago she had once watched the horizon burn. Now it was blooming with green. She closed her eyes, and though the wind carried no words, she could almost hear his voice, calm and steady as ever. "The land is whole again. Now so must we be." But fate, as always, asks a price. The crown that balanced peace would soon tilt under the weight of politics and necessity. And the woman who had waited for him through chaos would soon learn that love, like empire, must often survive by endurance rather than joy. For though Liu Xiu had restored the Han, he had not yet restored himself. And the quiet rebel of Nanyang, the man who rose not by ambition but by gentleness, was about to face the cruelest test of all: power. Power has a strange silence to it. It does not roar when it arrives. It seeps in slow, weightless at first, then heavy as history itself. When Liu Xiu was proclaimed emperor in 25 CE, there were no grand cheers, no banners unfurled across the heavens. The people were too exhausted for celebration. They had buried too many sons, burned too many harvests, seen too many men declare themselves Son of Heaven. What made him different, they whispered, was not his claim, but his calm. He did not stride into the palace like a conqueror. He walked through its corridors like a man, entering a house that wasn't truly his. The marble floors of Luoyang still bore the stains of earlier wars. The air smelled of incense and dust, the scent of empires reborn too many times to remember what rebirth meant. Liu Xiu took his seat upon the dragon throne not as a victor, but as a custodian. His first decree was not about conquest or tribute. It was about grain. The people, he said simply, must eat before the emperor may speak. And thus began the era historians would later call the restoration of light, the Guangwu Zhongxing. But for the man who bore that light, the days ahead would be darker than any battlefield. The restoration of the Han Dynasty was not a single victory. It was a slow stitching of wounds across an empire still bleeding. Provinces in the south refused allegiance. Governors in the west acted as kings. Old aristocrats who had bent their knees to Wang Mang now returned in silk, pretending loyalty. In the north, famine still raged. Every morning, Liu Xiu sat at his desk before dawn. Reports from every corner of the realm arrived on bamboo slips, stacked high as his arm. He read them all. He ate little. He spoke even less. His ministers learned that silence from their emperor was not indifference but deep calculation. A habit formed in years of farming, where patience meant survival. He restructured the bureaucracy, reinstated scholars who had fled during the wars, and sent relief to villages rather than armies to cities. The strength of Han, he once told his aides, is not its palaces but its plows. The court began to realize that this emperor was unlike any before him. He did not revel in ceremony. He preferred maps to music, the sound of ink to flattery. He was not a man who built monuments. To himself, he built bridges, irrigation canals, and trust. Yet in the stillness of the night, when the candles burned low and the hall fell quiet, he sometimes touched the jade seal of his throne and wondered what it had cost him, because to rule an empire meant to live without the simplicity that once defined him. During his northern campaigns, he had wed Guo Shentong, a woman of powerful lineage whose marriage secured the loyalty of a crucial faction. It was a union forged not from affection, but from survival. She was intelligent, proud, and politically aware, qualities that kept the fragile empire intact in its infancy. But where there was power, there was also distance. In those same years, the memory of Yin Lihua lingered, not as a fantasy, but as the moral compass he could not afford to lose. While Guo Shentong commanded alliances, Yin Lihua had commanded his heart long before he became an emperor. She remained in Nanyang then, governing her family's affairs, aiding local officials, and tending to the displaced who had followed her family after the wars. Those who saw her said she carried herself with the serenity of one who knew her place in history, even if that place was beside a man she could not yet stand beside. When the court stabilized, Liu Xiu summoned her to Luoyang. Historians rarely write of this reunion, but they record the moment. Simply, the emperor saw Lady Yin and was gladdened. What the scrolls do not say is that it was the first time in years he had smiled without calculation. Yin Lihua's presence in Luoyang marked a turning point, not politically but spiritually. The emperor who had spent years repairing a world broken by greed was finally reminded of why he had rebuilt it in the first place. She did not seek titles or recognition. When courtiers pressed her to assert herself, she declined with grace. "If the empire is well," she said, "what need have I for rank?" Her humility was her influence. In her presence, Liu Xiu rediscovered the human beneath the crown. He spoke of agriculture, of floods, of education, the same concerns that had guided his early life. She listened, offered insight, and tempered his harsher impulses. "Justice," she once told him, "is not to make men fear you, but to make them need not fear anyone." He carried those words into every judgment. Thereafter, meanwhile, the remnants of rebellion still stirred in the west. Gong Sun Shu, the self-declared emperor of Chengdu, refused to submit. His armies still held the fertile lands of Sichuan. Advisors urged Liu Xiu to crush him swiftly, but he waited, knowing that exhaustion was a sharper weapon than the sword. "A river clears itself when the storm is gone," he said. Let him tire of his reflection. His patience prevailed. Years later, when Gong Sun Shu's generals defected and the walls of Chengdu finally fell, Liu Xiu forbade massacre. "The people have had enough of emperors," he said. "Let them have peace instead." For a world ravaged by ambition, his restraint became its salvation. But the court, ever suspicious of stillness, began to stir against Yin Lihua. Her presence unsettled the Empress Guo. Rumors spread that she was a sorceress of words, that she whispered into the emperor's ear, that she bewitched his virtue. In truth, all she did was remind him of the man he used to be. Liu Xiu bore the tension with his usual quiet endurance. He would not shame his empress publicly, nor would he banish the woman who steadied his soul. So he lived between two worlds, one of crown and politics, one of memory and meaning. He spent his nights working, his mornings hearing petitions, and his evenings walking the palace gardens where no one dared follow. Servants said they often saw him standing alone beneath the cypress trees, staring at the moon as if listening for someone's voice carried on the wind. It was during these years that the Eastern Han truly began to heal. His policies, measured, humane, deliberate, restored order without oppression. The people began calling him the Emperor of the Plow, a ruler who governed like a farmer tends his field, patiently, season by season, knowing that harvest takes time. But healing a nation is lonelier than commanding an army. Victory binds men together. Peace isolates them. Even those closest to him could not see the subtle wear in his spirit, the way his humility was both strength and wound. He ruled without arrogance because he feared it. He forgave easily because He knew what hatred could destroy. He appeared unshakable, yet within him grew the quiet dread that every emperor before him had succumbed to the same illusion, that they could save men from themselves. In the 8th year of his reign, floods returned to the Yellow River. Villages drowned. Farmers fled to higher ground. Advisors urged him to divert funds from reconstruction to fortification to protect the capital first. He refused. "If I protect the walls," he said, "and the people die outside them, then I rule over corpses." He sent half the palace treasury to rebuild the levees. When the officials protested that the state would go bankrupt, he smiled faintly. "An empty treasury can be refilled," he said. "An empty heart cannot." And so the people saw, perhaps, for the first time in generations, an emperor who ruled not by fear, but by conscience. Yet conscience has its cost. Each act of mercy bred resentment among the proud, each gesture of humility felt like an insult to those who measured worth in rank. Empress Gua, feeling her authority fade, grew colder. Her family's arrogance began to infect the court. Her brother, Guangwu, abused his influence, bribing officials, extorting land. Liu Xiu endured for as long as he could, hoping reform would come through example. But the corruption festered. It was Yin Lihua who, once again, gave him clarity. "You cannot heal every wound by gentleness," she told him. "Sometimes mercy to the corrupt is cruelty to the people." Her words struck like sunlight through fog. The man who had built his empire on restraint realized that true balance meant knowing when to be still and when to act. He summoned Guangwu to court, stripped him of his titles, and exiled him. No one expected. It was the first decisive stroke of steel from an emperor known for compassion. In that single act, he reminded the court that mercy was not weakness, and humility not submission. But in doing so, he set in motion a chain of events that would reach into his own heart. For the power of the Guo clan began to crumble, and with it, the marriage that had held the empire's politics together. As the capital adjusted to this new balance, Liu Xiu withdrew once more into solitude. He spent more time with scholars, reviewing old texts, teaching young princes. He found solace in the company of Yin Lihua, though their meetings were rare and proper. The courtiers whispered, but he ignored them. In one recorded exchange, the only one historians preserved, Liu Xiu told his ministers, "A ruler's heart must have both steel and silk." They assumed he meant policy, but those who knew him understood. Steel was his duty, and silk was the woman who taught him how to wield it. By the end of the first decade of his reign, the Eastern Han was at peace. Trade returned, temples reopened, the people sowed fields again without fear. The scholar Ban Biao wrote that the emperor governed as heaven reigns, without sound, but everywhere. And yet, even in peace, shadows moved. For though the empire now stood steady, its emperor remained haunted by the question that had guided him since the beginning. Could gentleness truly hold a world together? Or must power, in the end, always harden the hand that holds it? He had restored the dynasty, but the balance between love and rule, between heart and crown, had only just begun to tilt. In the coming years, that balance would shatter, forcing him to make the one decision no man of compassion ever wishes to make: to hurt one heart in order to save 1,000. There are moments in history when love becomes more than affection. It becomes a form of resistance. 4 years, Liu Xiu, now Emperor Guangwu of Han, had governed a country torn by rebellion and famine, rebuilding not through conquest but through patience. Yet for all his achievements, his heart remained divided. He had restored the empire, but not the promise he once made beneath the ashes of Nanyang, to the woman who had waited, unseen, through the smoke of civil war. Yin Lihua had been the thread that never broke, the silent rhythm beneath the noise of empire. Her life had unfolded, in the shadow of battles fought and kingdoms reclaimed. She was neither consort nor queen, yet her name lingered in every whisper that passed through the palace halls. To the world, she was a memory. To him, she was a compass. The official chronicles of the Han say little about her in these years, only that she lived quietly in Luoyang, dignified in conduct and generous in heart. But silence, in her case, was not absence. It was endurance. When Liu Xiu finally summoned her to court again, the city was still rebuilding from decades of ruin. The walls were repaired, but the people's faith was not. Processions of officials came to pay homage to the emperor, yet the streets outside the palace were lined with widows and orphans. The empire was whole again on paper, not yet in spirit. In the middle of this delicate peace, Yin Lihua's arrival felt like the return of something the court had forgotten: humanity. She wore no jewels, only plain silk. Her hair was tied simply, her expression calm. When the courtiers bowed, she bowed lower. It was said that the air in the throne hall changed when she entered, lighter somehow, as if the weight of formality had eased. Liu Xiu rose from his seat, a rare gesture for an emperor, and greeted her with the same quiet smile he had worn years ago when he was still the farmer from Nanyang. He did not call her Lady Yin. He called her Lihua, and the sound of that name in the imperial hall was both scandal and poetry. The courtiers pretended not to notice, but history always does. Their reunion was not the passionate blaze of youth. It was the steady warmth of two people who had endured the same storm from opposite shores. In their shared silence there was understanding, the kind that needed no words. Liu Xiu's empire was stable now but fragile. Every decree was a negotiation, every alliance a thread that could snap. The Empress, Guangwu, remained a political necessity, her clan still powerful, her pride still sharp. To disturb that balance would risk unraveling the very peace he had built. Yet to continue living divided between affection and alliance was its own kind of torment. For years, he had learned to separate the man from the crown. Now, with Yin Lihua near, those boundaries began to blur. He asked her counsel often, not in court, but in the quiet gardens at dusk, where cypress shadows stretched across the stone paths. She spoke rarely, listened always, and when she did speak, her words were like the turning of seasons, inevitable, gentle, and true. "You have restored the Han," she once said softly, "but do not let the crown bury the man who restored it." It was advice he carried like armor. Her influence on the emperor was not through command, but through presence. He began to simplify court rituals, abolishing excess ceremonies that burdened the treasury. He redirected gold from palatial renovations to river restoration, from statues to schools. Ministers who once argued over titles found themselves measured instead by merit. It was as if the emperor had remembered what the empire had forgotten, that leadership was a form of service, not spectacle. Those who served close to him noticed the change. "The emperor has grown lighter," one scholar wrote. "He speaks of the people as if he loves them." Few understood that the light they saw came not from divine mandate, but from a single human being who reminded him why he sought peace in the first place. Yet the palace is not a place for simplicity. The same whispers that once mocked his humility now turned toward her. Some called her the hidden Empress. Others said she had bewitched the emperor with silence. Empress Guo felt her influence diminish, and behind her eyes, envy smoldered into fear. Still, Yin Lihua refused to rise to the bait. She stayed apart from court politics, dedicating herself to charity and the education of young noble women. She was often seen visiting the city outskirts, where the poorest families lived, bringing rice and herbs with her own hands. When officials asked why the emperor's favored lady walked among peasants, she answered, "How can I serve the Son of Heaven if I do not see the heaven he rules beneath?" Her grace disarmed resentment. Even her rivals began to respect her restraint. As the years passed, the balance between power and principle in the court shifted. The Guo clan, inflated by privilege, grew careless. Their greed became public, their arrogance intolerable. It was only a matter of time before the emperor's patience, long as it was, reached its end. But before politics could break, something more intimate occurred. In the spring of the 13th year of his reign, Liu Xiu hosted a private ceremony, quiet, unrecorded, known only through later writings. There were no drums, no public vows, No golden canopy, just the emperor, the woman he had once loved from afar, and a small gathering of witnesses. It was not a coronation. It was a completion, a wedding decades overdue. No one knows the words they spoke that day, but one line survives in legend. That Liu Xiu looked at her and said, "The world has taken too long to become gentle." If the wars of his youth had forged him into steel, that moment was the return of silk. He was still an emperor, but for the first time he allowed himself to be a man. Their union was not for the empire, it was for the balance the empire depended upon. With her beside him, the loneliness of power softened into something human again. But in the palace, every joy casts a shadow. Empress Guo's resentment became public. Her family began to conspire. Ministers loyal to the Guo faction protested Yin Lihua's presence, claiming that the emperor's heart clouded his judgment. Yet the empire itself said otherwise. The provinces prospered. The floods receded. Tax reliefs reached even the outer territories. The people adored him, and through him adored her. In taverns and fields, songs began to spread. The emperor sows peace, and the lady harvests grace. They were no longer just rulers. They had become symbols of renewal, of restraint, of the possibility that decency could survive power. But symbols are fragile things. When Guo Shintong's father died, the man who had anchored her political protection, the inevitable question arose: who would now stand as empress? The court divided instantly. To keep peace, many urged caution. To restore moral order, others urged change. And through it all, Yin Lihua remained silent, never once seeking her own elevation. Her restraint only deepened Liu Xiu's resolve. He saw in her silence the same strength that had carried him through war, the power to endure without bitterness. And he knew, as every wise man does, that mercy cannot coexist forever with injustice. In 41 CE, after years of quiet preparation, the emperor acted. The Guo clan's abuses were exposed publicly. Their allies fell, their privileges stripped. In the same breath that cleansed his court, Liu Xiu announced what he had long carried in his heart. Yin Lihua would be named Empress of Han. The decree shocked the ministers but calmed the people. For once, politics and morality aligned. The woman who had waded through chaos, who had served without seeking power, now received it not as reward, but as recognition. Her coronation was simple, almost austere. There were no jewels heavy enough to measure her worth, no speech elaborate enough to justify it. She walked to the altar in plain white silk, bowed to heaven, then to the emperor. It was said that when she rose, the entire court, even her rivals, lowered their heads, not out of fear, but out of respect. From that day forward, her title was Empressine, but to the emperor, she remained what she had always been, his balance. The empire entered a new calm. The policies of compassion continued. The treasury refilled. The scholars thrived. And behind every decree, there was a quiet trace of her thought. Fairness, moderation, empathy. Yet even in triumph, there was melancholy. For Liu Xiu knew that everything in this world, empires, peace, love, exists only by endurance. He had rebuilt the Han, but time would one day undo even his gentlest intentions. The only permanence was the way they had faced impermanence together. Years later, a court historian wrote, "When the emperor looked upon Empressine, he seemed to see the whole of his reign. How ruin can give birth to order, how silence can rebuild what noise has destroyed." And so, in a world where kings fell to greed and heroes to rage, Liu Xiu and Yin Lihua stood as something rarer. Two people who proved that gentleness could survive history. They had married amid ruins. But in doing so, they had rebuilt not only a dynasty, they had rebuilt the idea that love, at its highest form, is governance itself. The palace of Luoyang stood serene in the early morning mist, its rooftops glimmering with dew like 1,000 small mirrors reflecting a sky that had forgotten war. For the first time in decades, the drums of the Han Empire beat not for battle, but for ceremony, the sound of stability. It had been 16 years since the empire fell into chaos, and nearly as long since Liu Xiu first raised the banner of restoration. He had walked the path from farmer to general, from survivor to sovereign. Yet the most difficult transformation was not in what he had become, but in what he had chosen to remain. For most emperors, victory is an end. For him, it was a beginning. He ruled with the patience of one who knew how fragile peace could be. Every edict was measured, every punishment weighed. He no longer fought against armies. He fought against complacency, corruption, and the slow erosion of purpose that prosperity brings. Empress Yin Lihua had now been at his side for several years, her quiet wisdom woven into the rhythm of governance. Together, they embodied something the empire had not seen for generations: power without extravagance, authority without cruelty. To the court, she was the voice of moderation. To the emperor, she was the echo of his better self. She held no council seat, yet her influence reached every corner of the palace. When officials quarreled over taxation, her gentle reasoning settled the matter. If the people are to carry the state, they must first be able to stand. When the emperor considered rewarding generals with vast estates, she reminded him, "The land may be endless, but fairness is not." Her words shaped policy as surely as his decrees shaped the realm. Under their guidance, the empire's heart began to heal. Irrigation canals were rebuilt, famine relief organized, scholars reinstated in their posts, schools reopened, temples repaired, roads extended into forgotten provinces. The empire that had once starved now began to breathe again. But success in its own way is a test. As the years passed, peace gave rise to memory, and memory to ambition. The old generals who had followed Liu Xiu through war now demanded more than gratitude. They wanted privilege. Their sons, born after victory, carried the arrogance of inheritance rather than the humility of struggle. In the council hall, voices grew louder. "We restored the Han," one noble declared. "But what of our reward?" Liu Xiu listened, as he always did, without anger. "Your reward," he said quietly, "is that the Han was restored." Few understood that answer. The human heart, once it tastes peace, forgets its cost. He turned often to Yin Lihua in those years, not for counsel and policy, but for refuge in understanding. They spent their evenings walking the inner courtyards where the peach trees bloomed each spring, their petals scattering like snow upon the ponds. "The empire feels heavier now than it did in war," he once said to her. She smiled faintly. "Because in war you carried it with men. Now you carry it alone." He nodded. "Peace is a crown that never loosens." She looked toward the distant walls. "Then perhaps what you must build now is not an empire of stone, but an empire of conscience." Her words stayed with him. That year, Liu Xiu began a sweeping reform. He reduced noble privileges, curbed corruption, and demanded transparency in the administration of provinces. The court resisted. The old aristocrats, accustomed to indulgence, saw their fortunes shrink. The soldiers, once heroes, found themselves accountable to the same laws as farmers. Many grumbled, some rebelled quietly in their hearts, but the emperor held firm. "If the roots grow wild," he said, "the tree will strangle itself." To the people, he became not just ruler but moral example. They spoke of him as the emperor who eats like us, works like us, and remembers us. His modest habits, plain meals, simple robes, refusal to expand his palaces, became legend. And beside him, Empress Yin mirrored his restraint. She kept no lavish entourage, accepted no costly gifts. Her chambers were described as quiet as a scholar's study. When foreign emissaries arrived bearing treasures, she redirected them to the imperial granary. "Let gold feed mouths," she said, "not vanity." Together, they became the moral spine of a recovering nation. But even virtue casts a shadow. The nobles whispered that the empire had become too humble. They accused the emperor of weakening royal dignity, of letting the image of heaven's sun grow plain. Yet in the villages and fields, People began to pray not to heaven, but for their emperor, a reversal unseen in dynastic memory. And still, within that calm, there were tremors. The former Empress, Guangwu, lived in quiet seclusion after her removal. Though her title and influence had been stripped, her resentment endured. Her family's fall from power left wounds that her pride could not conceal. Her son, a prince by birth but not heir by choice, carried that bitterness like a seed waiting for soil. Liu Xiu knew this. He did not despise them. In truth, he pitied them. He visited Gu's residence once, unannounced, bringing gifts for her son. The servants trembled, expecting reproach. Instead, he said simply, "The past has been buried. Let us not dig it up again." Such mercy baffled even his closest advisors. But to him, vengeance was a luxury the emperor could not afford. The following years tested that belief. In the northwest, banditry returned. A coalition of corrupt governors began exploiting the emperor's leniency, hoarding grain and taxing the peasants. Illegally, reports reached Luoyang daily. The ministers urged harsh retribution. "You cannot reason with wolves," one said. Liu Xiu looked up from the bamboo slips. "Then let us first ask why wolves roam among us." He dispatched inspectors instead of armies, ordered amnesty for the common people, and focused punishment only on the guilty. Within 2 years, the unrest subsided. The victory was moral, not martial, and it confirmed what the people had come to believe, that their emperor's strength lay not in fear, but in restraint. Empress Yin's influence deepened in these years, though never ostentatiously. She advised the emperor to establish schools for women, not to defy tradition, but to preserve virtue through understanding rather than obedience. "A household led by ignorance," she said, "breeds chaos as surely as a kingdom led by greed." Under her guidance, the imperial court began training attendants and tutors who valued ethics over ambition. The Yin reforms, as later scholars called them, quietly changed the moral character of the palace for generations. But even as their governance flourished, both emperor and empress began to sense the slow erosion of time, that invisible enemy every dynasty must face. The emperor's hair silvered. The face that had once commanded armies now bore the lines of worry carved by decades of responsibility. Yet his eyes, when they met hers, still carried the same stillness, the same unspoken gratitude for the balance she gave him. Sometimes, during quiet evenings, he would pause at the window of his study and look toward her residence. The lantern light flickering there reminded him of the first time he saw her, a distant lamp against ruin. He realized that the empire he had built was only the echo of something smaller, gentler, more enduring. The space they had created between themselves, where power had no place and peace had no conditions. In that space, the emperor became human again. And in becoming human, he became something rarer than a conqueror, a ruler who could endure not through fear, but through understanding. Years later, when a minister asked him what the foundation of the Eastern Han truly was, Liu Xiu answered without hesitation. It was built not on soldiers or scholars, but on patience, and the patience was hers before it was mine. By then, the realm was flourishing. Trade routes stretched across the provinces. The borders were quiet. Famine had retreated to memory. The Eastern Han stood as a symbol of what civilization could recover after despair. And yet, beneath this calm, the emperor knew the inevitable truth. Empires, like seasons, ripen toward decay. The duty of a ruler was not to prevent decline, but to leave behind an example strong enough to outlive it. For that, he had already chosen his successor, their son, Liu Xiu, a young man of clarity and grace who bore his mother's calm and his father's conscience. The future of the dynasty would rest in the hands of a generation raised not by ambition, but by moderation. As the emperor watched his son train in the courtyard one morning, the young prince, steady with a wooden sword, he turned to Empress Yin and said, "He does not strike with force." She smiled. "Because he was taught to strike with purpose." He looked at her for a long time. "Then perhaps the Han will endure." and for a fleeting moment he allowed himself to believe it. But history is patient and fate rarely rests. Beyond the palace walls, whispers of succession began. Not of rebellion, but of inevitability. Ministers plotted alliances, courtiers sought favor, and time, as always, prepared to reclaim what it had given. Yet for now, in the twilight of his reign, Liu Xiu found peace. Not in monuments, not in conquest, but in the living testament beside him. The woman who had turned his life from rebellion to restoration, from silence to song. Together, they had proven that even in a world built on power, gentleness could govern, and that the true making of an emperor is not in how he rules the world, but in how he keeps his soul intact while doing. The imperial palace at Luoyang had changed. What was once a fortress of survival had become a sanctuary of civility. The air no longer smelled of blood and ash but of sandalwood and ink. Musicians rehearsed in quiet courtyards. Scholars debated beneath the colonnades. Children laughed among the peach trees. It was a world reborn, and at its still center stood a woman who never sought to rule it. Empress Yin Lihua had become the quiet pulse of the Eastern Han. Her presence was subtle, her voice soft, her face serene, but her influence rippled through every chamber and courtyard. Ministers bowed lower when she passed, not out of fear but respect. Even those who envied her could not deny the gravity of her dignity. She ruled nothing, yet everything moved through her orbit. Liu Xiu, the Emperor Guangwu, relied on her judgment more than he admitted aloud. She was the conscience of his reign, the mirror in which his policies reflected their human cost. When the ministers praised new conquests, she asked about the displaced. When they rejoiced over tax revenue, she asked about the farmers. Her questions, never accusations, reshaped the court's sense of duty. She did not sit among the officials, but the officials began to speak as if she might be listening. In the early years of her reign as Empress, Yin Lihua devoted herself to reconstruction, of morals as much as of buildings. The palace, though grand, became known for its simplicity. She banned extravagance in dress, reducing the weight of jewels and gold that adorned noblewomen. Instead, she encouraged charity, using the palace workshops to weave cloth for widows and refugees. Her example spread. Soon, even the wives of high officials began to emulate her restraint. If the Empress can live simply, they whispered, what shame have we to live otherwise? She established schools for the daughters of scholars and generals, an unprecedented act in an age that measured women by silence, not knowledge. She taught that understanding brought harmony, that the strength of a household lay not in obedience but in wisdom. Under her guidance, a new generation of women learned to read the classic of filial piety and the Analects, planting seeds of virtue that would quietly influence centuries to come. And yet, for all her moral authority, she remained strangely alone. Power isolates, even when it is tempered with grace. The emperor loved her. That much was clear to anyone who watched him. His eyes softened when she entered the room. His temper eased when she spoke. But the empire belonged to him, and the empire was endless. Between meetings, decrees, and endless ceremonies, even their rare moments together became swallowed by duty. At night, she sometimes stood by the palace windows, gazing at the city lights below. She could see the people, tiny lanterns flickering in the darkness, and feel both their gratitude and their distance. She had become a symbol to them, not a person. The empire revered her, but it no longer knew her. And in the deep hours before dawn, when the palace fell silent, she felt the quiet ache that all who serve righteousness eventually feel, the weight of being good in a world that never stops testing goodness. She never spoke of it. Instead, she focused on shaping the one legacy that mattered most, their son, Liu Xiu, the future Emperor Ming of Han. He was young but serious, a boy of calm intelligence and rare empathy. He had inherited her restraint and his father's quiet sense of purpose. From the moment he could speak, she taught him not of conquest but of compassion. When he studied the wars that founded their dynasty, She asked him what became of the villages left behind. When he learned law, she asked him whether justice still existed when mercy was absent. "You must rule with both," she told him. "For justice without mercy builds only fear, and mercy without justice invites ruin." These were lessons that would define his reign long after hers. The court saw her shaping the prince and admired her composure. But admiration breeds envy, and envy breeds whisper. Some said she was too gentle to guide politics. Others said she hid ambition under virtue. To their minds, no woman could influence power without desiring it. They misunderstood her completely. Yin Lihua's strength was not in command, it was in restraint. She believed that power, once possessed, corrupts the heart unless it is constantly relinquished. So she released it every day. Every choice she made reaffirmed that the empire's virtue must outlive her own presence. But her humility did not protect her from sorrow. As the years passed, the emperor aged. His once dark hair silvered, his step slowed, and his gaze grew distant. The man who had once carried the world on his shoulders now bore the weariness of having held it too long. He often sat beside her in the garden, beneath the same willow trees where they once spoke of rebuilding. "Do you think heaven grows tired of us?" he asked her one evening. She smiled. "Heaven does not tire of those who labor honestly. And yet," he said, "every day feels shorter. That is because you no longer measure time in victories," she replied, "but in peace." He nodded, and for a moment, he looked not like an emperor but like the farmer she had first known, the man who once promised that the world would be gentle again. In those twilight years, her role deepened. Further, the emperor's health declined, and with it, the burden of governance fell increasingly to the empress. She presided over ceremonies, received petitions, and mediated disputes among the imperial princes. Her fairness was legendary. Even those who opposed her admitted that she could read a man's character as clearly as others read words. Ministers began to call her the mother of balance. But the more harmony she created, the more fragile it became. Power, even benevolent, invites decay. Some officials grew complacent. Others schemed for the succession. Factions arose, those loyal to the crown prince and those who saw opportunity in uncertainty. Through it all, she remained unshaken. "The storm is part of the season," she told her attendants. "If we cannot prevent it, we must teach the trees to bend." Her poise became the empire's stillness. When the emperor's illness deepened, she took charge of correspondence, reading reports late into the night by lamplight. Her handwriting, neat and steady, was often mistaken for the emperor's own. The people noticed the change but found comfort in it. For them, Empress Yin was not just the emperor's wife. She was the soul of his reign. When farmers prayed for rain, they invoked her name beside his, believing her virtue could move heaven itself. And perhaps it did. In the summer of 56 CE, after years of calm, prosperity, the skies opened with the heaviest rains in decades. Crops flourished, rivers filled, and the empire rejoiced. Scholars interpreted it as heaven's blessing for a just reign. The emperor smiled faintly and said, "If heaven rewards anyone, it is her. But even heaven's blessings cannot delay time." The following spring, Liu Xiu's strength began to fade. He could no longer attend court daily. Ministers came to his bedside to receive orders. The empress sat nearby, silent, her presence both comfort and command. She did not cry, for grief, too, could unsettle an empire. When the end came, it was gentle, like everything he had built. The emperor's final words to her were recorded simply, "You have made the world gentle again." He died in the 5th month of 57 CE, after 32 years of rule. The court mourned, the nation wept, and for 3 days, even the markets of Luoyang fell silent. Yin Lihua did not appear in public during the mourning period. She withdrew to her chambers, fasting, praying, and writing letters, not of lament, but of gratitude. "Heaven," she wrote, "granted me the rare gift of walking beside a man who ruled without cruelty. I ask for no more. When she finally emerged, draped in white, her composure stilled the entire court. The ministers bowed deeply, seeing not grief but grace. She addressed them briefly. The emperor's work is done. The Han must live through virtue, not memory. It was the last order she ever gave. From that day on, she became Empress Dowager Yin, the living embodiment of the dynasty's conscience. Her son ascended the throne as Emperor Ming, carrying forward her lessons of humility and humanity. In the years that followed, she rarely appeared in state functions. Instead, she lived quietly, tending to the imperial gardens, teaching her grandchildren, and overseeing the education of palace women. When visitors came, they found her surrounded by books rather than attendants. She no longer needed to guide the empire. She had already shaped the hearts of those who would. And yet, even as the seasons turned and the empire flourished, a quiet truth remained. Her presence, like her life, was not loud. It was not carved in stone or sung in the streets. It was woven into the daily rhythm of a nation that had learned, through her, that gentleness could rule as firmly as power. In the end, the woman behind the throne became something rarer than an empress. She became a memory that never hardened into myth. For history remembers her as the mother of a dynasty, the wife of a restorer, the symbol of virtue. But to those who look closely, her true title was simpler still, the keeper of balance in a world that had forgotten it. The empire mourned, but the sun still rose over Luoyang. After the death of Emperor Guangwu, the mourning drums of the palace rang out once again. Not for conquest, not for ceremony, but for continuity. The Eastern Han had lost its founder, yet the realm did not collapse. The streets did not riot, the provinces did not rebel. Farmers still sowed their fields, traders still crossed the rivers, the world continued to turn. That, above all, was his final victory, that the empire could survive without him. And at the quiet heart of that survival stood Empress Dowager Yin Lihua. She wore no crown now, only a simple headdress of white jade, a symbol of mourning and restraint. Her title had changed, but her purpose had not. She was no longer the emperor's wife. She was the guardian of his legacy. Her son, Emperor Ming Luzhuang, was young but steady, a man of intellect and empathy who carried his mother's calm and his father's conscience. When he ascended the throne, he wept before the ancestral tablets, vowing to govern as my father ruled, and remember as my mother remembers. The ministers watched him with cautious hope. Young emperors were fragile things, too easily swayed by vanity, power, or flattery. But those who had known the late emperor soon saw the same quiet steadiness in the son. He listens before speaking, one said, as his mother taught him. In the early years of his reign, the court still trembled with uncertainty. Factions whispered of new beginnings, of shifts in power. Some sought to influence the young ruler through greed or fear. Others sought to revive the corruption that had been restrained under Guangwu's discipline. But they had underestimated the Empress Dowager. Though she seldom appeared at council, her influence reached every chamber. Letters written in her delicate, measured script arrived quietly to ministers and generals alike. They contained no threats, no commands, only reminders of integrity, of moderation, of the fragile trust between ruler and ruled. She never lectured, she guided. Emperor Ming visited her daily. Their conversations were brief but profound. She did not ask him about decrees or policies. She asked whether the people were fed, whether the scholars felt heard, whether justice had been done. Without cruelty. He once told her that the ministers called him too lenient. She smiled and replied, "If mercy is your fault, may heaven forgive you slowly." Her guidance shaped him as profoundly as his father's legacy. Under her watch, the empire entered a period of prosperity known later as the Bright Restoration. Taxes were light, agriculture flourished, trade expanded along the western roads. The empire, once divided by famine and war, became a landscape of abundance. But peace, as ever, is fragile. The palace began to hum with the low tremors of ambition. As Emperor Ming matured, so did the men around him, nobles and courtiers who mistook stability for weakness. They whispered that the dowager's shadow loomed too large, that the young emperor's will was still bound by his mother's counsel. Some urged him to distance himself. "Your Majesty," they said, "a ruler must stand alone." But Emperor Ming only smiled. "Even the sun stands above the earth," he replied, "but it shines because the earth reflects it." It was not defiance, it was devotion. And yet, the more virtuous the court appeared, the more cunning became the corruption beneath it. The Guo clan, remnants of the deposed Empress's family, began to reemerge, weaving alliances through marriages and favors. Some ministers sought to use their resurgence to undermine the Yin family's influence. When word reached the Empress Dowager, she did not retaliate. "Power," she said, "is like water. If you strike it, it scatters. If you guide it, it clears." Instead of purges, she ordered reconciliation. She invited the widows and daughters of the Guo lineage to palace ceremonies, restored minor titles stripped during the previous reign, and wrote publicly in the state records, "The virtue of Han is forgiveness. The past is the teacher of peace, not its enemy." Her gesture stunned the court. In one act of mercy, she defused a generation of resentment. The Guo clan, humbled by grace, faded quietly from intrigue. That year, the empire celebrated her 60th birthday with modest ceremonies. No grand festival, no marble statues, only prayers, poems, and a simple banquet attended by scholars, farmers, and orphans she had supported. The emperor insisted on serving her himself. When he poured her wine, she gently stopped his hand. "The son who serves his mother serves heaven as well," he said. "Tonight, let heaven drink with us." She laughed softly, her first true laughter in years. But time is merciless even to the virtuous. Her health began to wane soon after. The long years of restraint, the sleepless nights of vigilance, had worn her more deeply than she admitted. The court physicians prescribed rest, but she refused indulgence. "A garden untended withers," she said. "How can I rest when the empire is still growing?" Still, age forced stillness upon her. She spent her days in the Hall of Gentle Radiance, surrounded by scrolls, calligraphy, and the soft chirping of caged birds. The emperor visited often, bringing reports for her to read. She no longer corrected his decisions. She affirmed them, proud to see her teachings live beyond her presence. Sometimes, when he asked what troubled her, she would say only, "I worry that peace has made the empire forget hunger." He would answer, "Then I will remind them, mother, through fairness, through memory." Her eyes would soften. "Then perhaps I can rest." As the years passed, her reputation became legend. The common people called her the White Empress, for she was said to favor plain white robes in her later years, the color of purity and mourning combined, as if she carried remembrance into every day of peace. When she appeared in public, crowds knelt by the thousands. They threw not jewels or flowers at her procession, but small pouches of rice, symbols of sustenance, the simplest gratitude a people could give. The poets wrote of her as the mother who fed the nation's heart. And though she accepted their reverence with humility, there was something wistful in her eyes when she looked upon them. She had lived through the empire's collapse and its resurrection. She had seen men devour one another for crowns and banners. She had seen her husband rebuild it all with the quiet strength of mercy. And now, at the end of her days, she saw a generation that knew only comfort, a generation who had forgotten what sacrifice looked like. Perhaps that is why her final years were not filled with rest but reflection. In her last winter, she asked to be taken once more to the gardens where she and the late emperor used to walk. The plum trees were blooming through frost, their fragrance sharp and clean. She stood there for a long time, leaning on her staff, gazing toward the horizon where the city disappeared into mist. An attendant asked softly what she was thinking. She replied, "When I first met him, the world was burning. When I married him, the world was broken. Now the world is whole again. But I wonder if it remembers how it was healed." The attendant had no answer. She turned and smiled faintly. Perhaps that is how peace ends. Not with war, but with forgetfulness. That night, she wrote her final letter to her son. It contained no instruction, only gratitude. "You have ruled with balance, and balance is all that endures. Remember your father not for his victories, but for his silences. Remember your mother not for her patience, but for her faith. The mandate of heaven is not a crown, it is a candle. Guard its flame, my son, for the night always returns." A few weeks later, in the early spring of 64 CE, Empress Dowager Yin Lihua passed away in her sleep. There were no omens in the sky, no storms, no tremors. Only a gentle wind that rustled the plum blossoms outside her window. The emperor declared, "A mourning period of 100 days, but the people grieved longer." Farmers laid down their tools. Scholars wrote verses in her name. In the temples, offerings were made not of gold but of grain, just as she would have wanted. She was buried beside Emperor Guangwu in the mausoleum of Lingtai, their tombs aligned so that the rising sun would touch both at once. The dynasty endured for another century and a half, a testament not to conquest but to conscience. Historians later wrote that the Eastern Han was born from his courage and sustained by her virtue. But the truest epitaph belonged not to stone or scrolls. It was whispered in the fields, generation after generation, by those who never forgot her name. She made the empire gentle and taught it how to stay that way. The wind over Luoyang carried a softer tone after her passing. The city that had once wept for the emperor now wept again, not in despair, but in gratitude. The mourning banners that hung from rooftops fluttered like white wings, and for weeks, the people spoke her name in every prayer, every quiet moment before dawn. They said that when Empress Dowager Yin Lihua died, even the river near the capital slowed its current, as if time itself had paused to bow. But death did not end her reign. The empire she and Emperor Guangwu had built did not fade with their bodies. It breathed, alive in every law, every custom, every act of fairness that carried their signature long after the ink dried. And at the heart of it stood her son, Emperor Ming of Han Luzhuang, a man shaped, not by ambition but by memory. He ruled from the same palace his parents once walked, surrounded by portraits of his ancestors, yet guided by a presence that could not be painted. His mother's example. In the years following her burial, Emperor Ming often visited her tomb at dawn. He brought no entourage, no ceremony, only a handful of scholars and a single scroll of her writing. Kneeling before the stone, he would read her last letter aloud, as if the words could still anchor him to her counsel. "The mandate of heaven is not a crown, it is a candle." He repeated those words, often in court, reminding his ministers that power, like flame, must give light without consuming itself. His reign began not with conquest but with consolidation, the continuation of the moral order his parents had forged. The Eastern Han, once fragile, entered a new season of strength and intellect. Temples were repaired, borders secured, schools reopened in every province. Trade revived across the Silk Roads, carrying silk, paper, and philosophy farther than any army could march. But beneath every act of governance was her voice, still whispering through him. He adopted her policy of moderation, lowering taxes, simplifying rituals, and rewarding honesty over flattery. He reinstated forgotten scholars, granted pardons to minor offenders, and refused to execute rivals without cause. His court became known as the Court of Reflection, a place where debate was valued more than obedience. One minister wrote, "His Majesty governs not through fear of punishment, but through shame of disappointing virtue." It is as if his mother still sits behind the throne. It was true. She did, in spirit, in principle, in the steady conscience of the dynasty itself. The emperor commissioned the compilation of the Book of Filial Piety to be taught in schools throughout the empire, believing that moral education was the only safeguard against decay. "My mother's gentleness," he said, "is stronger than 10,000 laws." The nation began to call her the Eternal Mother. For the first time in generations, peace lasted long enough for children to grow old under the same sky. Farmers learned to trust the harvest again, merchants to travel without fear. The frontier tribes, seeing the empire's fairness, sent tribute instead of threats. The Chinese heartland glowed with a prosperity that would later be called the bright peace of Ming and Zhang. But peace is never without price. The emperor's compassion, though sincere, was constantly tested by the ambitions of men who had never lived through war. The younger nobles, born into stability, mistook gentleness for weakness. They sought luxury where their fathers had known struggle. Palaces grew more ornate, feasts more lavish, vanity more casual. It was the cycle Yin Lihua had feared. Prosperity dulls remembrance. When news reached the emperor that a governor in the southern provinces had built a mansion larger than the imperial residence, he summoned the man to court. "Did my father teach you excess?" he asked. The governor stammered that it was merely in celebration of peace. The emperor answered, "Then let your peace begin in humility." He stripped the man of his office but spared his life. The same balance of justice and mercy that his mother had taught him. At night, alone in his study, he would reread her letters and writings, which had been preserved by palace scribes. They were not filled with grand philosophy, only small truths written in a woman's clear hand. The empire is a household. Govern it as a mother tends her children. Feed them, teach them, forgive them, and correct them. Do this long enough and they will grow kind, even when you are gone. Those words became the silent constitution of his reign. He founded new academies of ethics, emphasizing not only Confucian doctrine but also compassion in governance. The virtue of humanity. He believed that wisdom without kindness was tyranny in disguise. The officials who rose under his reign were not the loudest or most cunning, but the most sincere. Through them, Yin Lihua's philosophy, that strength and gentleness are not opposites, became institutional. It shaped the empire's bureaucracy, its art, even its law. The Eastern Han began to value empathy as a measure of civilization itself. But history, always in motion, does not let serenity last unchallenged. In his middle years, Emperor Ming faced unrest on the western frontier. Ambitious generals demanded war, seeking glory against nomadic tribes. The emperor hesitated. He remembered his mother's caution, that wars of pride destroy nations faster than rebellions of need. At last, he agreed to a limited campaign, not for conquest but for peace. His orders were precise. No burning of villages, no harm to captives. We march not for domination, but for dialogue. The campaign ended swiftly. The tribes, moved by his restraint, offered peace treaties rather than defiance. When his generals returned boasting of victory, he rebuked them. "Victory is when mothers do not mourn," he said. It was as though Yin Lihua had spoken through him once more. Her influence stretched beyond policy into the very imagination of the empire. Artists painted her as the embodiment of virtue. Poets compared her to the moon, constant yet unclaimable. In villages, mothers told their daughters stories of the gentle empress who ruled with grace, teaching them that kindness was not weakness but wisdom disguised. Her legacy even transcended gender. Scholars began using her example to educate male officials on humility and duty. Govern as Empress Yin governed. Her heart, they would say, a phrase that entered the lexicon of the imperial academies. And as decades passed, her name became synonymous with balance itself. In 70 CE, when Emperor Ming commissioned a memorial for his parents, he chose not marble or jade, but stone carved with simple words. They built the world anew, not with swords, but with patience. He ordered that their mausoleum remain open to the people each spring, so that commoners could pay respects. The act was revolutionary. Emperors were gods to be worshipped from afar, not family to be visited. But he wanted his mother's example to belong to all. Thousands came. Some brought offerings of rice, others of plum blossoms, the flower that blooms through frost, her symbol. They prayed not for riches or favor, but for endurance. The emperor himself attended each year, kneeling in silence before the twin tombs of his parents. The chroniclers wrote that he often lingered long after the ceremonies ended, watching the first light of dawn touch both stones. He believes, one minister noted, that as long as the sun still reaches them together, the empire will remain whole. And indeed, for many years it did. Under Emperor Ming and his successor Emperor Zhang, the Eastern Han reached its zenith. China expanded its cultural influence across Asia, arts flourished, and science advanced. It was an age of stability so luminous that later historians called it the silver light of Han, the reflection of the gentleness that had once begun with a farmer's dream and a woman's faith. But no light lasts forever. Near the end of his life, Emperor Ming confided to his attendants, "The world will forget her name in time, but perhaps it will remember her nature, that mercy can be mightier than conquest." He looked toward the horizon where Luoyang's rooftops glimmered in the fading light, and he whispered, as if to her, "You were right, mother. The world can be gentle, if someone keeps it that way." In the centuries that followed, dynasties rose and fell, wars returned, palaces burned. Yet even as stone crumbled and scrolls vanished, the legend of Yin Lihua endured, not in temples or statues, but in the rhythm of the people she once ruled. Every time a ruler spared a rival, every time a farmer fed a stranger, every time a teacher taught patience. Before pride, her spirit flickered back to life, the invisible candle she had lit in an age of chaos still burning across time. And perhaps that is the truest measure of immortality. Not to live forever, but to teach the world how to live without you. For though empires fall, mothers of empires never die. They live in the conscience of those who remember that mercy, not might, is what keeps a nation whole. The empire that Emperor Ming inherited from his parents had become a living monument to their memory. The roads were safe, the granaries full, the temples rebuilt. Across the provinces, the name of the Eastern Han carried the weight of justice and the fragrance of peace. But even light, no matter how pure, eventually meets the edge of shadow. By the third decade of his reign, the emperor's hair had turned silver, his stride slower, his voice softer. The courtiers who once saw him as a young idealist now saw him as the aging father of a flourishing empire. And yet, behind the calm of prosperity, he sensed what few could see, the subtle fraying of virtue. Peace, he knew, has a way of dulling the soul. The generation that had grown up under his rule had never known hunger, invasion, or rebellion. They saw order not as a gift but as a birthright. Nobles spent fortunes on banquets. Governors built mansions that rivaled palaces. The younger scholars spoke more of rank than righteousness. The courtiers, once humble before the throne, began to speak in tones of entitlement. The emperor watched it unfold, as if watching a candle burn too close to its own wax. He remembered his mother's words. Perhaps that is how peace ends, not with war, but with forgetfulness. At night, when the halls emptied and the oil lamps flickered against the polished stone, he would walk alone to the ancestral shrine, the temple of radiant virtue, built in honor of his parents. Inside, their portraits hung side by side. His father's calm gaze, his mother's gentle eyes. He often spoke to them aloud, as though time might carry his words backward. "You built the world from ashes," he whispered once, "and I have only kept it from burning again. But how do I keep it from rotting?" No answer came, of course, only the echo of his own breath, like wind through an old tree. In those moments, he realized that legacy is not preservation, it is endurance. What his parents left him was not perfection, but the duty to remember that perfection is impossible. Still, he tried. He expanded the imperial academies, hoping that education would renew moral strength. He commissioned the translation of Buddhist texts newly arrived from the West, fascinated by their teaching of compassion and impermanence, concepts that mirrored his mother's heart. He reformed the census to ease the burden on peasants, reminding the nobles that the strength of an empire rests not on its palaces, but its fields. But he also knew that reforms could not outlive human nature. His ministers began to argue among themselves, not over ethics but over precedents. Scholars divided into factions, each claiming to hold the true interpretation of Confucius. Even the academies he built became battlefields of pride. And through it all, the emperor grew quieter, watching history repeat its cycles with weary clarity. In his 63rd year, as illness began to shadow his days, he withdrew from most affairs of state. He spent his mornings reading in the Hall of Still Waters, where his mother once taught him to write. The same sunlight that had once shone on her pages now fell across his trembling hands. He could almost hear her voice guiding him through the brushstrokes. Write slowly. The ink must breathe. He found comfort in small rituals, burning incense, listening to the bells of the capital, feeding the palace cranes that gathered near his window. Each gesture reminded him that life, like governance, was an act of care rather than control. Outside the palace walls, the world still moved in quiet prosperity. The Silk Road thrived, bringing strange goods and stranger ideas from India and Persia. Chinese envoys returned with stories of distant kingdoms, golden temples, and wise monks who spoke of rebirth. The emperor listened to these tales with fascination, wondering if the souls of his parents might one day walk those far roads, reborn into new light. Yet even in curiosity, he felt a growing detachment, as if watching his own life from afar. The courtiers mistook it for serenity. It was, in truth, a kind of mourning, the slow grief of one who knows that no amount of goodness can hold back time. In his final years, he began writing letters, not decrees or manifestos, but reflections meant for the future emperors of Han. He titled the collection The Record of Gentle Rule. In them, he warned of arrogance disguised as progress, of luxury disguised as civilization. Power decays not when it is taken, he wrote, but when it believes itself eternal. My father taught mercy. My mother taught memory. If the empire forgets either, it will return to dust faster than it was raised. These writings would later become essential reading for generations of officials, quoted long after his dynasty was gone. As his illness worsened, he grew too weak to walk. Ministers came daily to his bedside to receive instructions. They expected orders. He gave them parables. If a tree grows too tall, he told them once, it must bend or break. The same is true of nations. He knew the end was near when spring arrived, and he could no longer hear the sound of the plum blossoms opening outside his window, the sound his mother had loved most. The doctors prescribed rest. He dismissed them with a smile. Rest is not what the dying need, he said. It is remembrance. He asked to be taken one last time to the ancestral shrine. They carried him there at dawn, wrapped in silk, his face pale but peaceful. When they set him before the portraits, he looked long at his mother's face and whispered, "You were right. Mercy endures longer than marble." Then he closed his eyes. He died that morning, as quietly as he had lived, with no storm, no omen, no thunder, only the faint flutter of a dove that flew across the open courtyard as if carrying his soul toward the east. The empire grieved once more. The courtiers wept, the common people fasted, and the temples filled with the low chant of morning prayers. But the grief this time was different. It was not the shock of loss. It was the gratitude of completion. The age of Guangwu and Yin Lihua, the era of light and balance, had come to its natural twilight. The new emperor, Zhang, ascended the throne with humility, continuing their policies for a time. But even as stability endured, the subtle erosion of memory began again. Factions returned. Ambition awoke. The same tides of history that had once drowned dynasties stirred beneath the calm surface. And yet, something had changed forever. Because even as greed crept back into palaces and arrogance into courts, a trace of gentleness remained in the people. The spirit of Yin Lihua's mercy, of Liu Xiu's restraint, of Ming's reflection, all lingered like the echo of a bell long after the sound fades. Centuries later, when later dynasties looked back at the Eastern Han, they called it not merely an age of strength but of grace. They spoke of the emperors who ruled with humanity, of the Empress who ruled without ruling, of the dynasty that proved goodness could govern as surely as fear. In the annals of the Book of Later Han, historians would write, "When the sun set on the house of Guangwu, it left behind a glow that endured for generations, not of gold, but of gentleness. And that glow, faint though it became, would outlive the empire itself. Because true light does not die when the day ends. It lingers in the memory of warmth, in the simple belief that a world once torn apart could be made whole again, not by might, but by mercy." The light that had begun in chaos now faded into legend. A century after Liu Xiu and Yin Lihua had rebuilt their fractured world, the Eastern Han still stood proud, orderly, radiant in its memory. Of them, the great rivers flowed under bridges they had restored, the people tilled fields they had reclaimed, and scholars studied in academies founded under their name. The empire had grown older, more ornate, more distant from its roots. But still, in the heart of every story, their names whispered like a prayer. In Luoyang, the imperial capital, time itself seemed to hold its breath. The city of white walls and golden roofs had survived wars and floods, each generation repairing what the last had broken. Yet, in the hush of evening, when the drums ceased and the lanterns flickered, along the river, the air still carried something ancient, a sense that the spirit of its founders had never left. The mausoleum of Lingtai, where they lay together, had become more than a tomb. It was a pilgrimage, not for those seeking miracles but for those seeking meaning. Scholars, poets, even humble farmers made the journey each spring, walking barefoot along the dusty road lined with willows. They came not to ask for blessings but to remember that gentleness once ruled the earth. At dawn, the twin mounds of their graves glowed faintly gold as the sun broke over the horizon. The light touched both at once, his and hers, exactly as the architects had intended. And every year, as the light met stone, the people bowed their heads and whispered the same words. The emperor restored the world. The empress restored the heart. The rituals were simple, almost silent. Offerings of rice, plum blossoms, and handwritten poems left in the grass. Children were told to speak softly there, for it was said that the empress still listened to the voices of the humble. Centuries passed. Dynasties rose and fell. New rulers claimed heaven's mandate, each promising renewal. Some were conquerors, others dreamers, many tyrants. But even as time buried their names under dust, the story of the farmer who became emperor and the woman who made him human again endured. It was not preserved by the courts, they too would crumble, but by the people. Old men told it by firelight to grandchildren during long winters, of the man who refused to kill when he could forgive, and the woman who refused to rule when she could guide. Travelers carried it across mountains and deserts, adapting the tale for every generation that forgot what kindness sounded like. And so, while palaces decayed, memory persisted, not in marble, but in mercy. By the time the Han Dynasty neared its end, when corruption gnawed at its foundations and rebellion again simmered in the provinces, some still spoke their names like a distant prayer. Soldiers invoked Liu Xiu's patience before battle. Widows whispered Yin Lihua's humility as they fed the poor. Even rebels, those who tore down the empire, claimed they sought to restore the spirit that she and her husband once embodied. That was the irony of immortality. They could not stop the fall of their creation, but their example shaped the conscience of those who rebuilt it afterward. When the last emperor of Han, broken and defeated, surrendered the throne generations later, he sent one final decree to be carved in stone. May future rulers remember Guangwu's mercy and Yin's virtue, for in them the empire found its soul. It was the only truth left to say. History, ever hungry, consumed the rest, but the essence of their reign, its calm, its restraint, its rare compassion, survived in fragments, like sunlight scattered through shattered glass. Even when the Han was gone, China itself remembered their lesson, that the strength of a nation lies not in its armies, but in the grace with which it heals. The historians who wrote their final chronicle centuries later could not help but sound awed. In the Book of Later Han, the passage describing their era is spare but luminous. He governed by stillness, she by silence. Between them, the world was balanced. It is difficult to know what remains of them now. The tombs have been weathered by wind and rain, the inscriptions worn to ghosts of words. Yet the idea they built, that gentleness can restore what violence destroys, is indestructible, because every age rediscovers them anew. 1,000 years later, during the Tang Dynasty, poets stood at their graves and wept, calling Yin Lihua the quiet star that steadied the emperor's sky. In the Ming Dynasty, scholars studying governance cited her as proof that virtue is the mother of law. And in the modern age, when historians trace the endurance of Chinese civilization, they find her shadow still there. Not in temples or statues, but in the cultural instinct toward balance, moderation, and compassion. Her name, Yin Lihua, means beautiful flower of shade. It fits perfectly. She bloomed not under the spotlight of power, but beneath it, where light meets stillness. She made her husband's greatness possible not by standing beside him, but by grounding him like the earth beneath the sky. Even Liu Xiu, who founded a dynasty and reshaped history, could never escape her gravity. His legacy, no matter how grand, always led back to her, to the calm intelligence that steadied his resolve, to the mercy that shaped his policies, to the love that made his empire human. Together, they became more than rulers. They became a rhythm, the eternal balance between action and reflection, strength and tenderness, heaven and earth, man and woman. In the imagination of later generations, they were no longer just figures of history. They were archetypes, reminders that leadership without love is tyranny, and love without discipline is fragility. The empire they left behind may have crumbled, but the world they envisioned, where peace is built not on conquest but on understanding, still waits in the hearts of those who dream of gentler ages. And so, the story ends as it began, not with war, but with a vow whispered by a young man long ago, standing beneath the burning sky of a dying dynasty. If the world can ever be gentle again, it will be because of someone like her. Centuries have passed, empires have come and gone. The vow remains, because in every age where power hardens the heart, the memory of Yin Lihua softens it. Again, because every time a ruler hesitates before cruelty, or a nation rebuilds instead of avenges, her hand, unseen, unspoken, steadies history. And somewhere, beyond the reach of time, the farmer and the noblewoman still walk together beneath the plum blossoms of Nanyang. Two souls at peace, the sun rising upon both their faces, the empire they restored finally silent, finally whole.